Are you tired of being told what color to paint your front door? Well, let me tell you, I thought buying my dream house was the best thing to ever happen to me and my family. But little did I know, it would turn into a nightmare that would keep me up at night. My name is Sarah, and when my husband Mark and I bought our beautiful house in a fancy neighborhood, I thought we had made it. You know, the American dream: big backyard, flowers by the porch, a red door that made me smile every time I pulled into the driveway. My daughter Emma even picked out her favorite pink flowers to plant in the front yard. Everything was perfect. Until it wasn't. We had barely unpacked when I heard a loud knock on the door. I opened it to find a man in a suit holding a clipboard, standing like he owned the place. "You're in violation," he said without even saying hello. "Violation? Of what?" I asked, confused. He pointed to our red door. "Doors must be neutral colors. You'll be fined $250 if it's not changed in 7 days." My stomach dropped. I wanted to argue, but he just handed me a paper full of tiny words I couldn't even understand and walked away. Mark tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably just some grumpy old rule. But inside I felt like something wasn't right. Why was it such a big deal? And if they were this mad about a door, what else would they come after us for? That was just the start of the storm about to hit us. The next morning I decided to visit the HOA office. I mean, surely if I explained we were new they would be kind, right? But when I walked into the office, it felt like walking into a cold cave. Behind a huge desk sat a woman named Mrs. Patterson, with sharp eyes like a hawk. She didn't smile when I walked in. She just stared at me over her glasses. "Can I help you?" she asked in a voice that sounded like she didn't really want to help at all. I told her about the red door, how we didn't know about that rule, and asked if we could get an exception. She didn't even blink. Rules are rules. "If you don't like it, maybe this isn't the right neighborhood for you," she said coldly. My face turned red with anger and embarrassment. I wasn't trying to break rules, I just wanted to make a home for my family. I left the office holding back tears, but as I walked down the street, I noticed something weird. Neighbors were staring at me from their windows. One woman even whispered to another as I passed, like I was some criminal. When I got home, I found another paper stuffed in my mailbox. Another violation. This time it was because Emma had left her bike on the lawn instead of putting it in the garage. A $150 fine for a bike on the grass. I couldn't believe what was happening. And then that night as we sat down for dinner, we heard loud knocking on the door again. It was another HOA board member, this time taking pictures of our yard, our car, even Emma's toys. I asked him what he was doing and he just said, "Documenting." But for what? I started feeling scared in my own home. What if they didn't stop? What if they wanted to force us out? As Mark tried to calm me down, I looked at Emma and realized I had to protect my family. But I didn't know yet how far the HOA would go, and what I would have to do to fight back. That night, after Emma fell asleep, Mark and I sat on the couch, staring at the pile of HOA violation papers on the table. It felt like we had been thrown into some secret war that we never signed up for. Mark tried to act strong, but I could see the worry in his eyes. "Sarah, will figure this out. Maybe we just need to follow their rules for a while," he said, trying to calm me. But deep inside, I knew that giving in would only make things worse. If we let them push us around now, they'd never stop. I decided right then that I wasn't going to let these people ruin my family's life. But what could I do? I didn't even know all the rules, and every time I asked questions, all they gave me were more threats and fines. The next morning, I went outside to clear my head, and that's when I saw old Mr. Jenkins, my neighbor 2 houses down. He was sitting on his porch, watching me like he had been expecting me. I hesitated, but he waved me over. "Rough week?" he asked with a kind smile. Something about him felt safe, like maybe he knew more than he was letting on. I nodded, telling him everything that had happened since we moved in: the red door, the bike fine, the man taking pictures. Mr. Jenkins shook his head and let out a long sigh. "You're not the first, you know. They do this to everyone new. Scare them, control them. But you don't have to let them win." My heart started beating faster. "What do you mean?" I asked. He leaned in closer. "You need to see what's really going on. Meet me tonight after dark. And come alone." His words gave me chills. Why was he being so secretive? But I was desperate to know more, so I agreed. As I walked back to my house, I felt a strange mix of fear and hope. Maybe Mr. Jenkins knew something that could help us. Maybe there was a way to fight back. When night fell and the neighborhood grew quiet, I waited until Mark and Emma were asleep. My heart was pounding so hard I was scared someone might hear it. I slipped out the back door and walked down the street to Mr. Jenkins' house. His porch light was off, but when I got closer, I saw him standing just inside the door, waiting. He motioned me inside quickly like he didn't want anyone to see. "Come on before someone notices," he whispered. Inside, his house was filled with boxes and papers stacked high, like he had been collecting things for years. He led me to the kitchen and closed all the blinds before sitting me down. "Listen, Sarah, there's something you need to know about this HOA. It's not just about keeping lawns neat or making sure houses look nice. It's about power and money. Lots of money." I stared at him, confused. "But how?" I asked. He pulled out a folder stuffed with papers, letters, emails, copies of checks. "They fine people for tiny things like what they're doing to you, and when people can't pay they put liens on their homes. If you don't pay the liens they take your house. Then they sell it and keep the money. I've seen it happen 3 times just this year." My mouth dropped open. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "But that's illegal, isn't it? They can't do that," I said, my voice shaking. Mr. Jenkins looked sad. "It should be, but they know all the loopholes. And everyone's too scared to fight them." I felt like the walls were closing in around me. Was my family next? Were they trying to take our house? Mr. Jenkins reached over and grabbed my hand. "But you're different, Sarah. You care. You're strong. Maybe you can stop them." I didn't know whether to cry or scream. Part of me wanted to run away from this mess, but another part of me was angry that they were hurting people, taking homes, scaring families. And if Mr. Jenkins was right, I couldn't let them win. As I walked back home that night, my mind was racing. I had to tell Mark, but how? What if the HOA found out? Would they come after us harder? But deep down, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about everything Mr. Jenkins had told me. My hands were shaking as I poured my coffee, and Mark could tell something was wrong. "Sarah, what happened? Where did you go last night?" he asked, concerned. I knew I had to tell him. So I sat down and spilled everything. The secret meeting with Mr. Jenkins, the files he showed me, and how the HOA was using fake fines to steal people's homes. Mark's face turned pale. "They're trying to take our house?" he whispered. I nodded, tears filling my eyes. "I think so. And if we don't stop them, they'll keep doing it to other families too." Mark stood up, running his hands through his hair, clearly overwhelmed. But then something changed in his eyes. Determination. "No. We're not going to let that happen," he said firmly. "If they want a fight, they've got one. But neither of us really knew how to start. How do you go up against people who hold all the power? How do you fight back when they make the rules?" That's when I remembered the folder Mr. Jenkins showed me. "We need proof," I said. "Real proof. Something we can take to a lawyer, or the news." Mark agreed, so that day while Emma was at school we sat down and made a plan. First, we would gather every letter, every fine, and every picture they took of our house. Then we'd talk to neighbors like Mr. Jenkins to see if they had stories too. Maybe if we all came together we could expose them. I felt a tiny spark of hope growing. But as we got up to start, there was a loud knock at the door. Mark and I froze. Slowly he opened it. Standing there was Mr. Thompson, the head of the HOA, with a big fake smile. "Good morning. I hope you're having a pleasant day," he said in a sugary voice that made my skin crawl. "Just here to drop off another notice." He handed Mark an envelope and walked away without another word. As soon as he was gone, Mark ripped it open. It was another fine, this time for having unapproved outdoor decorations. Decorations? We didn't have any. I looked around and spotted Emma's pink soccer ball sitting near the porch. Was that what they meant? It was like they were making up rules just to harass us. Mark slammed the paper on the table, furious. "That's it. They want war? They've got it." That same afternoon, Mark and I went door to door, talking to neighbors we barely knew. Some people were too scared to talk, quickly closing their doors when we mentioned the HOA. But others, like Mr. Jenkins, welcomed us in and told us their stories. There was Mrs. Alvarez, a sweet woman in her 70s, who had been fined for having non-compliant plants in her garden. Her favorite flowers. She showed us letters threatening to take her house if she didn't pay. Then there was a young couple, James and Lisa, who got fined because their dog's leash was too long. They even had photos taken secretly of them walking their dog, just like the man who took pictures of Emma. With every story, my anger grew. This wasn't just happening to us, it was happening to everyone. And the worst part? No one felt like they could fight back. They were all scared they'd lose their homes. "We're all prisoners in our own neighborhood," James said bitterly. But as we sat in his living room, I realized something. What if we don't fight alone? I asked. What if we all fight together? Everyone looked at me, surprised. "What do you mean?" Lisa asked. "I mean, what if we form a group? A group of homeowners who say, enough. If we go to a lawyer together, maybe we can stop this. For the first time, I saw hope in their eyes. You think that could work? Mrs. Alvarez asked. It has to, I said. Because if we don't stop them, they'll take everything. That night, we had a secret meeting in Mr. Jenkins' backyard. More neighbors than I expected showed up. People were tired of being scared. They wanted to fight back, but they just didn't know how. We talked about everything, the fines, the photos, the threats. We gathered all the letters and pictures people had. It was enough to fill a whole box. Mark looked around at everyone and said, they've been picking us off one by one because we were alone. But now we're not alone. Now we're a team. Everyone nodded, determination in their eyes. I felt a new sense of hope rising in my chest. Maybe we really could stop them. But just as we were finishing, headlights appeared at the end of Mr. Jenkins' yard. A car slowly pulled up and the window rolled down. It was Mr. Thompson, and he wasn't smiling this time. Nice little gathering you've got there, he said coldly. Hope you're not planning anything illegal. And with that he drove away, leaving us in silence. I could feel the fear returning, but I pushed it down. We keep going, I said firmly. No matter what. After Mr. Thompson's visit to Mr. Jenkins' backyard, everyone was on edge. The way he stared at us like he knew something we didn't, made my stomach twist in knots. But Mark squeezed my hand tightly and whispered, we're in this together. That gave me strength. The next day I gathered all the papers we had collected, fines, letters, secret photos, and put them in a big box. It felt like carrying proof of every unfair thing the HOA had done to us and our neighbors. Mark and I knew we needed help, real help, from someone who understood the law. So we called a lawyer named Ms. Green that Mr. Jenkins recommended. She agreed to meet us at her office. Sitting in her small room filled with books, I was nervous but hopeful. Ms. Green listened as we told her everything, sometimes raising her eyebrows in surprise. When we showed her the photos of strangers taking pictures of Emma, her face turned serious. This isn't just HOA overreach, she said. This is harassment and possibly criminal. My heart thudded hard. Can we do anything about it? I asked. She leaned forward, speaking slowly so we could understand. If we can prove they're abusing their power and breaking the law, we can take them to court and win. For the first time, I felt like maybe we had a chance. But Ms. Green warned us, be ready. They won't go down without a fight. That scared me, but I nodded. We're ready. Over the next few days, Mark and I worked day and night. We made copies of all the files and got signed statements from neighbors. Some were too scared to give their names, but others like Mr. Jenkins, Mrs. Alvarez, James, and Lisa stood brave. Meanwhile, the HOA seemed to know something was happening. Every day we got new fines. One for the grass being too long, even though Mark had mowed it that morning, another for excessive noise, when we were quietly eating dinner. They were trying to scare us. But instead of breaking us, it made us angrier, and more determined to win. Then, one evening as I was putting Emma to bed, we heard a loud bang at the door. Mark rushed to open it and there stood 2 police officers. My heart dropped. Are you Mark and Sarah? One officer asked, serious. Yes, Mark answered, nervous. We got a complaint that you were threatening members of the HOA board, the officer said. I gasped. That's not true. I cried. They're the ones threatening us. The officer sighed like he had heard it all before. Look, we don't know what's happening here, but if there's a dispute, you need to handle it through lawyers, not threats. I couldn't believe it. Mr. Thompson had actually called the police on us. After the officers left, I broke down crying. They're trying to make us look like the bad guys. I sobbed. Mark hugged me tightly. We're not giving up, he whispered. They want us scared, but we're stronger than that. The next day we told Ms. Green what had happened. She wasn't surprised. They'll try everything to scare you off. But don't let them. You're on the right path. She promised to file a lawsuit against the HOA and to get a court order to stop the harassment. But things got worse before they got better. A few days later, a notice was posted on our door. The HOA was trying to foreclose on our home, claiming we hadn't paid our fines. My knees went weak. They're going to take our house, I whispered, shaking. Mark held me up. No, they're not, he said firmly. We took the notice straight to Ms. Green, who promised to stop the foreclosure with an emergency court filing. But now the whole neighborhood was watching. Some neighbors whispered when we walked by, scared to be seen with us. Others gave us supportive nods. It was like a storm was coming and no one knew which way it would go. Finally, the day of the court hearing arrived. I dressed in my nicest clothes, even though my hands were trembling. Mark tried to keep calm, but I could see he was nervous too. Ms. Green met us outside the courthouse. "You're doing the right thing," she said, giving me a reassuring smile. Inside, Mr. Thompson and 2 other HOA board members sat at a long table, smirking like they had already won. But when Ms. Green stood up to speak, she was powerful. She showed the judge all the evidence, copies of every fine, photos they took of Emma, and the threats to take our home. She even had sworn statements from Mr. Jenkins and others. "This HOA is abusing its authority," Ms. Green said firmly. "They are harassing families, issuing false fines, and trying to steal homes. This must stop." Mr. Thompson's lawyer argued back, saying we were the ones breaking the rules. "They agreed to HOA rules when they moved in," the lawyer said. But Ms. Green didn't back down. No one agreed to be spied on. No one agreed to be harassed. No one agreed to have their homes stolen for unfair reasons. The judge listened carefully, frowning at the photos and letters. I held Mark's hand tightly, praying the judge would see the truth. After what felt like forever, the judge finally spoke. "Based on what I've seen, I'm issuing a temporary order to stop the HOA from taking any further action against this family until we have a full trial," he said. Relief flooded over me and I wanted to cry. We had won the first battle. But I knew it wasn't over. Word about the court hearing spread fast. By the next day, neighbors were knocking on our door, some with tears in their eyes. "Thank you for standing up," Mrs. Alvarez said, hugging me tightly. "We were too scared, but you gave us hope." Even James and Lisa stopped by, saying they wanted to join the fight officially. Our little group was growing stronger. But we weren't safe yet. The HOA board was furious. Mr. Thompson stormed by our house one afternoon, glaring at us like he wanted to explode. Mark stood at the door, arms crossed, daring him to say something. But Thompson just walked away, probably knowing anything he did could get him in more trouble. Ms. Green warned us that even though we won that day, the full trial was still coming. "We need to be ready for anything," she said. So we worked harder than ever, gathering more stories from neighbors, finding every piece of paper that showed how unfair the HOA had been, and preparing to tell our story to the judge. But even as we worked, I worried. What if we lost? What if they really did take our home? Every time I tucked Emma into bed, I wondered if this would still be her room next month. But then I would see Mark's determined face or hear a neighbor thank us, and I knew we had to keep going, not just for us but for everyone. The day of the big trial finally came. The courtroom was packed. Neighbors, reporters, even people from other towns who had heard about our fight. Ms. Green stood tall and confident, ready to tell our story. The judge looked serious as he called everyone to begin. This time, Ms. Green showed even more evidence. Stories from other homeowners, copies of fines for ridiculous reasons like wrong grass color or flowers too bright. She even had a video Mr. Jenkins had secretly recorded of a board meeting, where they talked about which house to fine next. My mouth dropped open as I watched the video play. It was clear as day, proof of their scheme. The judge leaned forward, watching closely. Then it was Mr. Thompson's turn. His lawyer tried to argue that the board was just following the rules, but even the judge looked skeptical. "Rules don't give you the right to destroy people's lives," the judge said sternly. Mark squeezed my hand, and I felt a flicker of hope grow into a flame. Finally, after hours of talking and showing evidence, the judge stood up and looked around the room. "This HOA has acted in ways that are unacceptable," he said. "I am ruling in favor of the homeowners." I gasped, tears streaming down my face. We had won.